After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they had seen the signs of the work he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. A large crowd was coming to him, and he asked Philip, "Where can we buy bread to feed these people?" He asked him this question as a test, because he knew what he was going to do. And Philip answered, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to give a little. Another disciple, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said, "There's a boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was a large area of grass, so the people sat down, about 5,000 in all. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he served them. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were all satisfied, he said to the disciples, "Gather the fragments so that nothing will be lost." The disciples gathered the fragments of the loaves and filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the signs of the work he had done, they began to say, "This indeed is a prophet who is to come into the world."
As you know, we've had a lot of planning and deliberation going on these days, and among those has been an issue that we talked about a ways back, and we mentioned from time to time again. That is looking seriously at the name that we will claim as a community when we relocate in our new mission field, and the number of reasons for that, as far as clearly identifying our mission and communicating who we are to the community that we move to. There's some interesting work going on about that. You'll be hearing more about that in the days, weeks, months ahead. But I'm remembering an earlier discussion about possible names for the church, and a suggestion that's been made a time or two. I've brought this up before. What was the suggested name?
All you can eat.
All you can eat for the church. I knew she was going to say it. I didn't even prompt her ahead of time. We say that because we eat well around here. Now, I've been in different churches across my lifetime, and they all tend to eat well, so I think we can say this about lots of churches, but we do it especially well here. And we are experiencing that today, of course, table fellowship as part of our worship time. I'd like to maintain that that name might not be the wrong name after all. Never suggested it was the wrong name. We say it somewhat kiddingly, but think about it. Look at the biblical tradition and how many times are folks eating? How many times is the table spread? How many times is the meal a common focal point for what's going on in the life of faith? Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. The meal covenant in the most ancient of tradition. The tradition of hospitality and sharing table fellowship. Remember how Abraham, when he sees those 3 strange messengers coming, first thing he does is get up and fix lunch, or tell Sarah to go and fix lunch, to extend the hospitality of the table. Jesus was constantly at the dinner table, sometimes getting in trouble because he was having table fellowship with tax collectors and sinners. And it was often in the setting of a dinner that an important conversation or parable or teaching would go on. Of course, all of the prophets and poets across the pages of Scripture talk about the coming kingdom, and what is it going to be when the kingdom comes in its fullness? A banquet. So all you can eat is a fitting phrase for who we know ourselves to be as faith community. The story you heard this morning is unique in that it's one of the very few accounts that we find consistently in all 4 of the Gospels. You know, the Gospel of John is very different from Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Lots of things that happen in there don't happen in the other ones. But here, the feeding of the 5,000, we've got a very unique story in John. feedings in all the other Gospels. In fact, two of them, there's two feedings. Feeding of 5,000, feeding of 4,000. 5,000 Jews, 4,000 Gentiles. Again, if I'm evaluating and looking at the Gospels and their stories as a whole, you kind of say, there must have been something important about Jesus feeding a large crowd. Because all the Gospel writers remembered and told the story. Some of them told it even twice. And if you think about the elements that are there in the story, it's not surprising. Gospel writers were remembering and passing on the story because it struck another memory of God's people in the wilderness being fed bread. And so here you have a setting of a large crowd out in the middle of nowhere. How are we going to feed them? They all have a common thread in which there's a small food supply, and it's multiplied where there's plenty, not just to feed everybody and have them full, but 12 baskets left over. All you can eat and then some. Certainly all of them, as well as remembering the wilderness and the feeding of the multitudes with the manna. It's also looking forward to the Eucharist, the sharing of the table that we do here and have across the centuries in our faith tradition, and eventually looking forward to that great banquet that will ultimately come when God's kingdom comes in all its fullness. John's story has some very unique features. We've got all the other accounts in those other Gospels, but in all of those, the part about what do we have and what are we going to do about it is pretty concise and brief. The disciples are not named as to who said what. It's just the disciples in general raise the objection, and Jesus tells them what to do to serve the crowd. Here you have specific characters with particular lines or statements that they make. And you got that little boy who's only here in John's account, who is symbolic in so many ways of the simple and humble gifts that we bring. Philip is the one who's addressed first. And do you remember in the story, Jesus asked him a question, and you can almost see him wink when he says it, because John tells us he asked him this to test him. He already knew what he was going to do. He said, where are we going to buy food for all these people to eat? And Philip's response was one of ultimate pessimism. 6 months' wages wouldn't be enough to feed all of them even a little bit. That's followed by Andrew, who's identified the boy and said, we got 5 loaves and 2 fish here, but what are they among so many people? Talk about a buzzkill. Talk about pessimism. 6 months' wages wouldn't buy enough for even everybody to get a small amount. There's this bread and fish here, but what are they among so many? In our storytellers group, as we were working this, someone made the comment, this sounds for all the world like a church board meeting. Or committee meeting or whatever. And if you laugh, it's because you know our tendency. When we look at the challenges we're up against, and what sometimes seem to be diminishing resources, it's easy for us to wring our hands and state our anxiety and be quick in voicing the problem that we see and the lack of solution that we see before us. And this story is so poignant in many ways because it lifts up that detail. It gives us 2 names and faces. I don't know what Philip or Andrew look like, but in my imagination I see each of them. And you've got these 2 guys, one of whom we're told Jesus is actually giving a little bit of a test to, who flunks the test by saying, too many people, too little food, no money to buy enough for all of them to be fed. What are we going to do? In fact, there's an interesting kind of tension or gap between the very statement that Andrew himself makes. He begins by saying, what does he say, Carol? Read it aloud.
There's a boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish.
Now, can you say that with enthusiasm?
Hey, there's a boy here with barley loaves and 2 fish.
Real enthusiasm.
Jesus, there is a boy here, and he's got 5 loaves and 2 fishes.
Can everybody say it along with her? There's a boy here with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Optimistically, 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes. 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes. But then with pessimism,
But what are they among so many people?
can you say that louder and more pessimistically?
But what are they among so many people?
Can you say it with me?
But what are they among so many people?
Ain't it awful? But what are they among so gap that's there between the optimism of the first thing that Andrew says, and even in his own statement after that, the pessimism and skepticism. There's a gap involved here. Mind the gap. What in the world does that mean? Alex?
Mind the Gap is a sign on the subway train. As you said, on the subway train, there's a gap between the platform and the train, and if you fall down it, it's bad things happen.
Is that subway train just anywhere?
Maybe the subway, but they have the gap on the train.
But I mean, what part of the world?
In the UK.
That's the University of Kentucky, right?
United Kingdom.
United Kingdom, okay. So a unique bit of jargon. And do you see signs like this? Are they actually posted?
Oh yes, they're posted. They actually have warnings as well.
And I've never been to England. It's on my bucket list. I've been to lots of other places in the world. But I'm told by people who've been there that if you're riding the train or the subway, is it a lady's voice or a
Oh yes,
woman's
they
voice?
have the automated voice because they're going to mind the gap. It's mind the gap.
So, every time the door opens, I'm beginning. I asked Alex to reflect on that for us because mind the gap might be an interesting kind of direction that we draw from this story. Different kind of gap, not the gap between the train and the platform, but the gap, kind of like you have in a nerve synapse from one stimulus to the response, the gap that lives in each of us, the gap that lives in our community of faith, the gap between, there's a boy here with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and, oh boy, are they among so many. That gap that's here among us. One commentator has, I think, very creatively proposed that the commission for disciples, what the disciples are asked to do in this story, and what we're asked to do in our life of faith, is to mind the gap, to tend to that gap between our despair and our hope, that gap between the harsh realities and difficulties of our situation and the radiant hope and possibility that God holds before us in the life of God's kingdom. That the job of the disciple is always to be ready for and attuned to and preparing others for the Jesus factor, for the intervention of Christ in the world, in us, in ways that make the transition, as it happens in the story, from the mere 5 loaves and 2 fish to a bountiful feast that feeds the crowd and then some. Or from the meager resources that a small community of struggling disciples bring to what God through the Holy Spirit multiplies and gives to the world in a process that is unfolded across the ages and come to our own life of faith as well. As we pay attention to the story, pay attention to what happens in the gap, and notice one other curious detail. In all the other accounts of the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus blesses the loaves. He's already told the disciples to have the crowd seated, and some of them they're in groups. And it's the disciples who feed the crowd. In this story, in John's account, Jesus feeds the crowd. He gave thanks for the loaves, and then he distributes them. I think there's intentionality in John telling the story in that way. The Jesus factor. Jesus not only serves the bread, as we'll hear later in the 6th chapter of John, Jesus is the bread. This event is the backdrop as later, in response to what had happened, he's saying to the same crowds, I am the bread of life. It's the first of a series of such statements when Jesus says that he's stood in that gap and become what the world needs. First, I am the bread. Then later he says, I am the light of the world. Then later he says, I'm the gate for the sheep to come in and out of and find good pasture. Then he says, I'm the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. Then he says, I'm the way, the truth, the life. I'm the true vine in whom you abide and find life. All those ways that Jesus becomes for us the full and complete gift. That's the mysterious part of the story that I invite us to stay attuned to and to live with, especially over these days as we're considering in our life of faith being faithful in little, letting the things that seem potentially insignificant or small we have to offer, be fully surrendered to God. A couple of other details. Only John tells us it's barley loaves. All the others, they say loaves of fish. Why is barley significant? It's poor people's bread. Barley is the cheapest of grains. Barley bread is what poor people ate. It's as though we're saying, in a sack lunch that day, the boy had a couple of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for the sack lunches at Union Gospel Mission, rather than a box lunch from Jason's Deli. That it's from taking even the most meager of resources that the Spirit of Christ is at work, multiplying, expanding, growing. And let's fall short of the one tendency we often have with this story, to picture that it was all that little boy and what an example he was with his generosity. You know, the story just says Andrew knew this guy had food. And for all we know, they could have swiped his lunch. It doesn't tell us that he came up and offered it to him. Just that we have a boy here with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Because you see, our tendency is to say, oh, the little boy was generous, therefore everybody who was sort of storing bread and fish in their clothes started pulling it out and sharing. It's our way of trying to comprehend the miracle or explain for it. But the problem is, it ends up being a nice little morality fable about the power of human generosity. And I believe this story is about something far greater than that. I've also, in 64 years of life, become fairly pessimistic about the ultimate impact of the power of human generosity. That it's faith that touches something deeper than just being generous. It's collectively our becoming something and having something to offer that is more than the sum total of what we bring. Now, literally, after a while, we're going to take bread and put it on the table, and it's going to go to the Union Gospel Mission and feed the hungry, and we'll have exactly as much bread as we brought collectively. We celebrate that because there's still a lot more than would have been there or given otherwise. But to go to the point of 12 baskets left over, to go to the experience of a meal that feeds all, is to acknowledge and trust that God's at work in a powerful, miraculous, new way in which, as we've seen again and again, we become something more than just the sum total of who we are. Something greater happens than just the gifts and energies we brought. As we see in everyday life, and especially as we see in the life we share together in Christian community, what could be seen as potentially small and insignificant, when offered in the spirit of faithfulness, is taken and multiplied and made as an ultimate gift by the one to whom we have been given the gifts of life as well. The most famous of Mother Teresa's quotes across her many years of service, I'm sure you've heard it. She said, "We can do no great things, only small things with great love." We come today in our worship with some small things, some loaves of bread, some cards that are in your worship resources, some gifts and talents and abilities and resources that we have in our own lives. In our time of response here in a moment, as we did last week, you recall we wrote on these bread cards that are in the baskets how we've experienced faithfulness in our lives and our life together as a church. On this card today, we invite you to write, what are the small things that I can do that can be multiplied through faith in God? What are the things that I would often think of as insignificant, that I can give, that I can offer, and that can be expanded and multiplied through our faith in God? As we take a few moments in prayer and response, we encourage you to write that and place them here in the baskets along with the cards from last week as we continue this emphasis across our Found Faithful Stewardship emphasis. During that same time, if you brought loaves of bread, we encourage you to take those to the table. You might choose to light one of the prayer candles that, as you'll see, spell the word faith. But in our time of worship together, let us all be attuned to how we are holding something in our lives as well. It might seem small and insignificant, but that through the power of Christ can grow and expand into something far more greater than we might ever know or imagine. As the song says, take my 5 loaves and 2 fishes, do with them as you wish. I surrender.
Well,